Hi everyone, welcome to my review of the ZMF Verite Closed. So these are headphones that I've long, wanted to get in for review, and until recently, I haven't had very extensive listening spells with the Verite Closed, which is the reason why you might not have heard me talk a lot about these cans. But I've always wanted to get these in. I've always wanted to experience ZMFs more closely. The only ZMF that I've had a significant amount of time with, I think, was the ZMF Auteur, which I personally owned, bought with my own money. This was way back, of course, and at that time I had the ZMF Auteur, I had the Focal Clears, and I had also upgraded to the Python Susvaras. The funny thing, my Auteur actually replaced my Susvaras for 2 weeks when my Susvaras were out with a driver failure. At that point, you know how in different points of your life, you sort of like relate with different bands more, and you end up listening to the same track or the same album more and more over the course of a few days or a few weeks. So that was a time when I was listening to a lot of the Temple of the Dog and a lot of Chris Cornell songs. So way back, the Susvaras were amazing for that sort of genre, for Chris Cornell's vocals and the overall performance of especially Temple of the Dog, much more so than Soundgarden. So back then, once my Susvara driver failed, I was just listening to the Auteur, and I just had a magical couple of experiences listening to the Auteur, which I was at that time driving with various amps that I had, and I actually recall driving my ZMF Auteur with the speaker amp, which had brought in for Susvara, and the speaker amp actually, I thought, gave the Auteur a wider sound stage and perhaps a perception of greater detail. So the Auteur was magnificent. So I've loved the ZMF experience with the Auteur. I've also really appreciated ZMF because every time I've reached out to Zach and Bevan with any questions or comments, and even when I was buying my Auteur way back, I just thought they were magnificent in their customer service, in their authenticity. Some great service-oriented people, right? So a big shout out to Zach and Bevan. But in any case, so that was my experience with ZMF, and I've wanted to get these in, but these are harder to find at significantly discounted prices. Either this or its open bag brother, which basically meant that this didn't get reviewed on this channel until now. So a quick disclaimer is that I got this in as a loaner, but then I've promptly bought it. So that might give away the review, so to speak, but still bear with me because I don't think it's an open and shut case for everyone, this headphone. So I do want to talk about my impressions on who this might be for, who this might not be for. So as usual, I'll do my whole rundown in terms of the aesthetics, build and comfort. I'll talk about tonality, I'll talk about timbre, technical performance, and I'll do lots of interesting comparisons because I want to compare it with itself off different chains because I think it can be very chain sensitive in terms of how it presents sound and music and tonality. I want to talk about how it compares with open back planar magnetic headphones. It is a useful comparison because I do think if you're buying blind, it gives you a sense of how spacious or not spacious it is, which is the reason why I'm going to do comparison between this and open back planar magnetic headphones like the Aria, the TC I have over there. I'll do comparisons with this natural sort of, I guess, competitor, which is the Focal Stelia, which I used to own. And I'll also draw comparisons with the Legend Evos, which are fabulous IEMs, my favorite, because I do think that some people debate between getting IEMs and closebacks. So these are my Legend Evos. This has become my end game IEM. I've not looked at any other IEM after having bought these. I was tempted by the Noble Audio Sultans, but I still prefer the Legend Evos over the Sultans. And yeah, so given my use case, I just have one pair of IEMs and I drive it with my DAPs. I have a couple of pairs of DAPs. So I'll also talk about how this works off DAPs, like the FIO M17 and the Aslan Kern SP2000T I have here. So all that's for later. And finally, I'll conclude the review by talking about who this might not be for, or drawbacks rather. So that's the structure. And so this review is happening after a while. Work got in the way. As much as I like making content, just to generate discussion and share my views in as much detail as possible with all of you. I basically got really busy, but I'm really glad to have found the time now to do this. So to start with aesthetics, build and comfort. So aesthetically, it speaks for itself. I don't know how good my lighting is, but it is, or if the light is shining in the appropriate places. This is a stock monkey wood. I do want to get some of the fancier woods and some of the fancier limited edition ones at some point. I'm not sure if I'll ever own two, but you know, I do find them visually very appealing, and I think, as you know, does most of humanity. I found the Auteur magnificent to look at. I find this beautiful to look at. So these are the stock monkey woods, and of course the wood has some bearing on how the Verite close will present sound, from what I understand. I can only go by secondary research here because I've not auditioned or A/B'd between two different types of woods. So from what I understand, a lighter wood like the monkey pod and a more porous wood like the monkey pod will give you a greater sense of decay, but at the expense of a little bit of speed and pop or slam dynamics, call it what you will. But it is still a dynamic headphone. Let me get that out of the way. So that's the wood. The wood, despite being the stock wood, I find absolutely brilliant if you look at the natural grains. As a matter of fact, one of the reasons why I wanted to buy this Verite close is because I found that everything about this spoke to me. Its weight distribution, its sort of coloration or aesthetics. It's both pretty yet being somewhat understated compared to other ZMF cans. So I just think that this is something I can live with forever, hopefully forever. You know, and that's just, you know, a tall claim to make, of course, in audiophilia. And this is the sort of can I can also sometimes take to the office, I think, because although it's a bit flashy considering what most office headphones look like, it's significantly flashier than most office headphones, and it's huge. So, you know, I'm not exactly sure if I will, but I still think that, you know, if I wanted to, I could take it to a coffee place, you know, once in a while, just because it also isolates very well. So aesthetics wise, it's just absolutely stunning. Premium materials, handcrafted for the most part. Like, you know what you're getting into when you buy a ZMF. And as a matter of fact, aesthetics plays a significant part of the decision making and ownership pride and joy for ZMF owners, and as it should. There's nothing like it on the market. And build quality wise, it's a lot of premium materials. It's just, you know, very, very sturdily built. And comfort wise, I think it's absolutely masterclass. So the comfort is, I think, that sometimes gets somewhat understated when we talk about ZMF cans, because I mean the comfort is not just, so I mean people read about the weight, right? It comes in usually at around 450 grams, which varies depending on the kind of, you know, chassis you use or the wood you have on your ZMF cans. So this is a monkey pod, so this is around 450 grams. The first time I put it on my head, it did not feel like 450 grams. It felt like, I kid you not, it felt like 200 grams. Because the absolute weight on the scale is not necessarily the weight you perceive. And the weight distribution in this case is just so mind-blowing, right? I feel like this is as comfortable as, you know, as some of the most comfortable cans in the business, like the HD800S, like the Sennheiser 600 series, which are lighter, of course, but this isn't much heavier in terms of how you perceive it, honestly. So ZMF cans actually spoil you, and I'll get that at the end of my review in terms of how it's become difficult for me now to listen to other headphones, and I think you should know this because I have such widely varying headphones in terms of how they present sound. Like an Aria and this, they're like so night and day different in terms of how they present sound. So I'll talk about all that at the end of the review when I talk about the cons of owning a ZMF like this. But yeah, I mean, so even the comfort plays a part, and I think it's both a pro and a con. It's a pro or a positive in that, of course, it's comfortable and it's suitable for long-term listening. I've had this on a flight. I've had this for hours on my head. And I'm sensitive to clamp and weight, I think. Over time, I've become also sensitive to weight. But once and now that I try other headphones, which were, you know, previously fairly comfortable for me, like I do start perceiving clamp and all that. It isolates very well. So I had a crying baby, like a lot of you have had, and with all due respect and love to parents who have babies, and of course with all due love to babies, I love babies, but of course being on a flight with a crying baby is not an ideal situation. So yeah, I mean, this came in handy. This blocked out a lot of the sound of the wailing baby, if that matters. If it doesn't, or if this offends anyone, I apologize in advance, but that's just how I feel. So this had its use case on an airplane. I can put this on and work at my desk. I have a large window in my room, and I'm on the fourth floor of an apartment, so I get a lot of sounds coming in. I live in a supremely noisy city. I've heard that, you know, the average traffic levels in terms of sound in my city, Dhaka, is around 80 decibels sometimes. I haven't, you know, confirmed this, but it's really, really noisy in my city. So even though I'm on the fourth floor, I feel like this has a use case, because really open headphones like the TC over there are magical, I think, for me, especially in the evening. when it's quieter, and I get the blacker background and all that. But you know, during work hours, I feel like I'm really getting into this because of its isolation. So yeah, so that's it for build, aesthetics, and comfort. By the way, so I want to talk about the pads, of course. In this review, I don't want to get into a lot of detail about the pads because that'll make it unnecessarily long, and perhaps I'll do a second one. I am getting a Felix Euphoria tube amp and OTL in to drive this with, and that will get its own review, so that maybe that's when I'll talk more about pad rolling, or maybe I'll just drop a link to other reviews that have done a decent job of discussing how the sound changes with pads. Because one feature of ZMF cans, which you should fully exploit, is the fact that this changes tonality significantly depending on the pads you have on. So these are the stock Autor lambskin pads, which I like for comfort, also because I feel like to my ears this sort of gives you, you know, the Verite closed the most neutral sound with a wide stage, a certain openness that I don't perceive with other pads. I do have other pads in, so I have, you know, the two pairs of pads that came with it are the suede BE2 pads and the universal lambskin pads, and they do change the sound somewhat in very perceptible ways. And so you're likely to have a favorite. I stuck with the Autor lambskin because I like them, because they're comfortable, etc. So all these thoughts and impressions are based on the Autor lambskin pads, but like I said, I'll drop links to how the sound changes or might change for you with other pads. The cable I have here is a Headgear audio cable, which is a boutique Indian manufacturer. This is a Litz copper cable. It's a Litz coated copper cable with this braiding, which is nice. And yeah, it actually has some memory. The previous cables, I think, were more supple, but you know how it is. Like, you know, you win some, you lose some. In any case, to talk about tonality, so this is a bit confusing, I think, right, for a lot of people, because you either hear from people that the Verite closed is a very neutral sounding can with slight warmth, or you hear that it's a very warm set of cans. Now, frankly speaking, let's just first talk about the frequency response. The frequency response wise, this has a very linear and extended bass, very impressive. In fact, very planar-like, because from 20 to 50 hertz, it's a straight line. And you do perceive the presence of sub-bass in every track that token sub-bass frequencies, and the sub-bass is impressive. Between 50 to 150 hertz, there is a bit of a hump, but it's a nicely done hump. It's a tasteful hump, no pun intended. And the hump gives it, you know, a coloration, a warmth, a mid-bass presence, which is nice. But at no point do I feel like the mid-bass bleeds, and at no point do I feel like the mid-bass dominates the sub-bass, which would be a deal breaker for me. Because I'm the sort of person I obviously love a decent amount of mid-bass, but I need sub-bass to be a part of the picture, and I can't deal with cans in the long run that compromise sub-bass for mid-bass. So this is a very good balance of mid-bass and sub-bass, even though in terms of how it graphs, it might look more mid-bass oriented. It's not. I feel like it's a very well done bass with good balance and texture and detail and all that, which I'll get into, of course, in the technical performance section. So, and then there's a bit of warmth in the lower mid-range, and there's pinna gain. The pinna gain is not as in your face as it can be for cans like the Odyssey LCD5, which is somewhat forward, I think. Even some of the newer iterations of the 6XX cans can be pretty forward in the upper mid-range. So while this has pinna gain, which gives it a certain neutral character, I think, it's still more relaxed because there is a drop, there is a dip in around 3 kilohertz, which gives it just the right amount of laid-backness. I don't want to say it's as laid-back as the Hyphaman Susvara, which to me was fairly laid-back. It's warmer than Hyphaman Susvara, so don't get me wrong. There's a lot of things happening here. Like, it's warm, it's thick, it's laid-back, and so you have to take all these into account. But purely in terms of that upper mid-range laid-backness, it's not as laid-back as the Susvara, I think. But it's, you know, it still has pinna gain. And then there's some lower treble energy around 5.5K, which some people have pointed out as being just occasionally sibilant, which wasn't the case for me, by the way. And finally, the air frequencies are pretty much in line with Harman, except there is a little more energy around 9K, and I think there's more energy after 15K compared to Harman, which does give this a sense of spaciousness, airiness, and sort of sizzle, which is very, very well done. Overall, this is tuned. This is by far, in my experience, in my limited experience with ZMF cans, a very neutral headphone with a decent amount of warmth. So it's warm neutral is basically what I would say. Now to move on to technical performance, starting with resolution, it's a fairly resolving can, but then because I'm so used to planar magnetic headphones and like super high resolving headphones like the Focal Utopia, when I first put this on my ears, I was like, God, this is not as resolving as I wanted it to be, or it's not as resolving as Utopia. So I was a bit critical at first, but then I think having changed source gears with this, so the first time I was driving this off the FIO M17 DAP you see over there. It's actually plugged into its DC power because it gives it more juice to be able to drive my AB1266 TCs, which are standing right in front of right by the M17s. So I was just listening to this when I got this in. I was using this to drive the HiFiMAN Aria Stealth, which you see back there. So this combines extremely well with the HiFiMAN Aria Stealth. Why? Because this has a very smooth sound. This has a smooth sound. I don't want to say it's congested, but it's thick, which can be congested with the wrong set of cans, like with this. But so with the Aria Stealth, the way it works is because the Stealth is so grandiose and so much separation between images and so airy, and this is smooth, and the Aria Stealth can be a bit trebly without being bright, or it's bright without being sharp. So this pairs well with the smoother sound of the M17, smoother and thicker sound of the M17. However, when I got this in and I plugged it to my M17, I just didn't get a lot of detail. It was fairly resolving, but it wasn't as resolving as I thought it should have been, and it wasn't as resolving as it can be, as I found out later. So my first impressions was of the M17, and which I'll get into more later. But then I decided to drive it off full-sized desktop amps. So once I started doing that, especially the Matrix Audio Element X, which I have here, it's a fabulous all-in-one unit. So Matrix Audio is one of those Chinese companies that I have a lot of respect for. And they have great build quality, great execution of their DACs and amps. I have an Element X, the top of the line DAC amp combination and streamer. And I drive this using a linear filter on the Matrix Audio Element X, which gives this, which maximizes the resolution that this can offer. So driven at its best, this is a fairly resolving can. But it can be less resolving, I think, depending on what you drive it with. This wasn't very resolving off my Aslan Current 2000T DAP either. So this does require some juice, I think, to bring out its resolution. And I also understand the Matrix Audio Element X headphone outputs were designed for high impedance cans. That's what the brochure says. Yeah. So I'm still waiting for the Felix Euphoria, but having driven it off different sets of source gears, I do think that the resolution changes. The level of resolution changes, but at its best, it's a fairly resolving can. I think it somewhat justifies its $2,500 price point. It doesn't in a sense because it's perhaps just as resolving as a $1,500 can or a $1,700 can like an HD800S, or a $1,600 can like a HiFiMAN Aria. But then you have these headphones like the Aria and the HD800S are resolution monsters, right? I mean, these are these Halo products with which their manufacturers have captured the market. I mean, the Aria is a very famous HiFiMAN headphone because of what it does for its price. So perhaps it's not a fair comparison. I still think that in around $2,500, it's fairly resolving because it's not that far behind, let's say, a $3,000 headphone. Or it's at least as resolving, I think, as an Empyrean Elite, and certainly more resolving than a Meze Empyrean Original. Now, soundstage and imaging-wise, I do think it's interesting because soundstage-wise, this is a phenomenal sort of closeback because the way this has been designed is that the cup resonances are not the sort of nasty cup resonances you get with most closebacks. It's a closeback, so you do know that it's a closeback when you put this on, but the brain doesn't take that much time to adjust to this kind of a closeback in terms of how it's, damping has been handled. So I was listening to open backs when I got this in, and when I switched to this and then I switched back to an open back, I didn't get that sort of, rejection sort of tendency in my brain and to, not want to listen to a closed back because I didn't feel like I was sacrificing a whole lot of openness. So I'm not exactly sure how they have done this, but on a scale of 10 to 0, with 10 being as open as an Aria and 0 being as closed as, a commercial $200 non-audiophile grade closed back headphone, I think this is probably a 7. So it's a fairly open sounding closed back. You might not miss a lot of closed back open backs when you listen to this, because the other thing it does in terms of soundstage is that there's this sense of reverb or soundstage depth, and it's not exactly reverb, but a lot of people call it reverb. Basically what happens is when you put this on, and even of a solid state, the way it presents images and soundstage depth is somewhat tube-like, so you get a sense of very deep layering of how the sound comes at you. So it's still very three blobs. You get a center image, you get a right image and a left image, but all these images are coming at you from this distance, right? And you get a sense of, a three-dimensionality of how these images come at you. So that I cannot overstate enough, because that I think is a huge reason why I'm drawn to these cans. It has the characteristics of an open back headphone without sounding like an open back, if you know what I mean. And it's not something I've experienced in other closed back headphones. I do think the Celeste came close, and I'll talk about it in a separate review. But it's certainly more open sounding, I think, than a Stelia. It doesn't quite match the Stelia for imaging. I think the imaging here is just about decent, but the Stelia and Focal images are just magnificent in their preciseness and sharpness. But you don't feel like you're missing out on any precision of imaging. And finally, sound dynamics and speed-wise, a lot of people are saying that this is the fastest ZMF can, etc. I haven't heard the ZMF Verite open, and my Atrium is coming in. I don't perceive this as a particularly fast headphone, honestly. Like when I was switching back and forth between this and the Stelia, and this and the Aria, of course, is super fast, and then this and the Utopia, it's a slower headphone, but it sounds more natural. So much so that I feel like after A/Bing so much between this and other headphones, like the Stelia, like the Aria, and others, I almost feel like the speed here is what the speed should be. It's lower, but it just feels more natural for somehow. So that's a con of a ZMF can that I'll get into later, how it can spoil other headphones for you. And timbrally, it's just absolutely masterclass. You know this if you get in. This is just the best headphone for timbre, and I get emotional talking about its timbre. Not really, but you know what I mean. It's moving how timbrally accurate this headphone is. Okay, now to talk about comparisons. Firstly, to itself, like I was alluding, this didn't sound right of a few M17 DAP. It didn't sound right at all. So it does need a certain openness and cleanliness in its presentation. Someone said that this pairs extremely well with the Hugo 2, a Chord Hugo 2, because Chord DACs can be very analytical and bright, as some would say, especially the Hugo 2. So I do think I see where they're coming from, because this does require an analytical presentation in terms of your source gear. Of course, you can go exactly the other route and get like a warm and tubey amp and maybe a warm and tubey DAC, and just indulge in excessive tubiness and warmth and laid backness and naturalness and extreme decay, and just like lie on your recliner and listen to Norah Jones or some male or female artist that is crooning away and getting you all relaxed after a long day's work or over a weekend. I get that use case. I haven't done that for myself, because I'm the sort of guy who'll have these cans on and I'll listen to some female vocals and then some Megadeth, and then some jazz, and then some R&B, and then some hip-hop, electronic music, orchestra, some Hans Zimmer, and then go back to Metallica, etc. So for my use case, I like a solid state with this. I have a Felix Euphoria coming in. So for my use case, like I said, I didn't like it of the Few M17. The Few M17 requires or does better with headphones that are airy and spacious and have massive, great separation between images. So I didn't like the Verite close of the M17. I don't think you should drive this off DAC amp combos or DACs or amps that have a thicker presentation, because this presentation is thick to start with. So I don't like it when it gets thick, overly thick. I don't like it when it gets overly slow, but it can and has the tendency to. So if I only had the Few M17 to drive this with, I think I would have sold this off, honestly. It was very underwhelming. So soon after I tried this off my Aslan Kern SP2000 DAP, which has a tube mode and the solid state mode, which does not vary significantly with the Verite closed, but this is a sharper, cleaner, clearer presentation. And off this DAP, they're both ESS chipsets, by the way, both this and the M17, but they're very differently tuned. So of this, the Verite closed I thought was cleaner, had better extension on both sides, and was more neutral and more likable while retaining its significant amount of warmth. Well, not significant, but let's just say a tasteful amount of warmth. So this was a good combination. And finally, the best combination I've heard so far is with the Matrix Audio Element X. I wouldn't pair this with the HoloMay either, because I personally find the HoloMay to be somewhat on the laid back side, which I love. I think there's no other DAC that I would run my Abyss 1266 TC with, which is one of my most favorite headphones, and also Utopia. So I do think the natural timbre of the Hollow May is just wonderful. I would only use the Hollow May to drive this if I had a very, very hard, steely amp in the chain. But in any case, the Hollow May, is what it is. But I drive this with my Matrix Audio Element X, which is a Sabre DAC, an ESS308 DAC, and I even use the filter that gives that DAC its highest amount of linearity. I think it's the filter number 4, with which this is just amazing. And for whatever reason, not just because of output power, I think, but also perhaps the way the Element X is constructed to drive higher output impedance cans, or higher impedance cans rather. So with the Matrix Audio Element X, this slams like it's like slamming is going out of style. This slams like my Focal Utopia, kid you not. Just about, I think. Not completely the Utopia level, but just about. Great bass extension of my Matrix Element X. Great treble extension, linearity, clarity with that specific filter I talked about, filter 4, and very listenable. So that's it about comparisons with itself. How it compares with the Stelia is interesting. I think I owned the Stelia, so I know this headphone well. I've also A-B'd them because it's not enough to own something. I don't think you can draw comparisons of memory, honestly, unless you're A-B'ing. So this is something that I caution a lot of audiophiles, about, because you might think, yeah, I've owned a Susvara for 8 years or 8 months, and then I've owned a Verite Close for 4 months, but I haven't really A-B'd them, so I know exactly how they fare up. You need to listen to them side by side. And once you do, this is what happens, especially with these two. This is faster, more mid-bassy, in a sense punchier, but way faster. It's just fast. Transient responses are super snappy and, better imaging. But this easily takes it for soundstage, this easily takes it for timbre, and overall, I think frequency response, because this is slightly wonkier. This has so much mid-bass that it starts to show when you compare this with the Verite Closed. This is a very mid-bass oriented bass, which to my mind is not as tastefully done as the Verite Closed mid-bass to sub-bass sort of ratio, so to speak. And because it's so mid-bassy, its upper mid-range can be forward to balance out the mid-bass. It becomes a wonkier tuning that you like, I think, but I think this is a better tuning. So when A-B'ing, this just this just stand out as just a better tuned headphone in my mind. And even the speed and greater, snappiness that this has, I think, for whatever reason, starts to sound like it's not as realistic. Like you get impressed and you respect the drivers here for the speed that they can deliver, but you also start thinking, but this is perhaps the right speed. This perhaps is the right amount of decay. So that's the comparison. I think overall the Stelia sounds more industrial and more metallic and less natural than the Verite Closed. And I honestly would prefer, having heard them side by side now, this to the Stelia. Although this is slower and perhaps even slightly less resolving can. Because I don't think resolution is everything. I do think you need resolution, but for me, it's up to a point. And then after that point, it's not even diminishing returns. It's after a point of resolution, I think it becomes pretty much, superfluous unless there's something else happening with the resolution in terms of how it's being presented in a very beautiful and laid back or refined manner, which the Susvara can do incidentally. Now, I do want to say how it compares with open back cans like the Utopia and the Aria and the TC. So with the Utopia is of course one of my favorite cans, but the headphone amp DAC, which drives this to its fullest capacity and potential, doesn't necessarily work so well with Utopia. For example, the Matrix Audio Element X doesn't drive the Utopia to its best, I think. Impedance matching could be an issue, and of course the flavoring is the big issue because you need a clean and clear and very analytical DAC to make the sound like it can, in my mind, to its best potential tonality-wise. But the Utopia starts sounding thin of that sort of setup. The Utopia might start sounding thin also because this is so thick sounding. So it does damage your experience with other cans, I think, to some extent, both because the source that drives it to its best potential for me might not pair so well with the Utopia. The jury's still out for the Felix Euphoria because I've heard that headphone amp can drive both beautifully to respect to each of these cans' fullest potential. So that's coming in very soon. So you'll hear impressions of that on this channel. But barring that, everything that I have right now, I feel like that can drive this well, they don't drive the Utopia to its fullest potential in terms of tonality. because I need something thinner sounding to make this work to its fullest potential, which then doesn't work so well with the Utopia. I do want to say that when I A/B'd this with an Aria, I still really respected how open sounding this is. Not as open sounding as an Aria, but just the fact that it can somewhat trade blows or hold its own with an Aria, which is like the most open sounding headphone in terms of its separation between images, in terms of its airiness of presentation, spaciousness of stage. Just goes to show how great a job Zach has done with this ZMF can in terms of making it sound very open despite being a closed back. And finally, with the Abyss TC, the Abyss TC is its own beast, and it's over there. So nothing really compares to the Abyss TC in terms of resolution, maybe with the exception of Stax and SR1A, and its grandiosity and its slam and punch. And I still, love this, but of different setups, of course, because the same setup that drives this well, I think, also makes this sound thin. So that's basically where I'm going in terms of the disadvantages of this can, is because I do think it's a very different sounding headphone. So I understand why some people love the ZMF and only the ZMF and own like every ZMF, because they're so natural sounding, and while not being the most technical cans, that I think if you really get hooked to this, like I have, I'm beginning to become, they might spoil other cans for you, even quote unquote higher tier cans like, a Susvara or a TC. Now, I do want to say that I know people upgrade from a Verite Open or a close to a Susvara, and they think it's the right upgrade path, and they think that it's almost a logical upgrade path, because a Susvara, despite being a planar and having the Hyphaman slight thinness of mid-range presentation, does sound like an upgrade in terms of being more resolving, more refined, and all that, larger sounding, etc. Susvara is a brilliant can. For me, see, I'm coming from a stage where Susvara was my daily driver for about a year and a half, and I loved it, etc. And over time, I think in long-term usage, I started missing the last sort of, punch and slam in bass that Susvara didn't have to my ears. So I sold it off, as a lot of you might know. Now, going to this, having owned a Susvara, for example, I do appreciate things that it does instead of things that it doesn't do compared to Susvara, because there's a lot of things it doesn't do compared to Susvara, honestly. But then what it does do compared to any other can, with the exception of Utopia, is that it doesn't do anything badly. And that, I think, is the biggest takeaway from this video, that in addition to being this wonderfully built, the most stunning headphone available in the market, perhaps with the exception of limited edition runs of the Verite Closed, in addition to being so well crafted and having these premium materials and having the great customer service that Zach and Devin provide associated with owning one of these cans, lifetime driver warranty, in addition to its warmth and sort of, a certain tonality that might appeal to people, and there are people who only go for this tonality and nothing else, and I can see that, and why that would be the case. I think the other thing that stands out for me is its consistency of performance across the frequency spectrum, across technical performance traits. And for that, it receives my highest recommendation, honestly. So, bottom line is, wonderful, wonderful headphones, guys. If you get a chance to audition this or bring this in and, try this for yourself, please do. I don't think it makes a lot of sense to sit on the fence about this set of cans, because it's not just because it's wonderful, but also because it holds value in the secondary and tertiary market. You can always sell a ZMF can and there'll be lots of takers. So that's it for me, guys. I hope this review was useful. I'm very enamored with the ZMF Verite Closed, and a big shout out to Zach and Bivan once again for all your great customer service. I didn't buy it from ZMF, but I am buying the Atrium, and I really like talking to them and hearing their very detailed responses to my questions, and just having the back and forth with two very smart and caring people in the industry. That's it from me, Sajid Ahmed, signing out, and stay tuned for my next one. Bye-bye.